Today I'm going to talk about working with different kinds of light. Um, One of the advantages of living in New England is we have all sorts of different kinds of light, and I'm sure that's also true in other parts of the country, Shelley. And there's often a feeling that there is only one correct time of the day to get good pictures. But all the times of the day, all the different kinds of light we have to look at have their own offerings for us. They offer opportunities to get interesting images, and they offer challenges about how to get the most from the light that you see. And that's what we're going to talk about today is using different kinds of light, and at least some of the things you can do with them. So we get all sorts of light in New England: bright light, soft light for macros, overcast light, interesting storms, transillumination and sunsets, soft misty light, and rainbows. So a lot of different situations, and we're going to talk about these. We're going to talk about the golden hours. Golden hours are that time around sunset and sunrise when you have clear skies, so that you can see the light looking nice and orangey and warm. And that's often considered the best time to shoot. It certainly offers some great opportunities, whether it's a sunset or just using the light. We're going to talk about bright midday sun, which is often considered the worst time of the day to take pictures. And photographers will wring their hands about not wanting to go out on a bright sunny day. But if you use the light properly, you can get some interesting pictures in this kind of light as well. We'll talk about overcast, one of my favorite kinds of light, nice soft overcast light. Fog and mist provides great opportunities for shooting and getting interesting effects as you do that. Let's see, Nicole is here. Let me get her in. Hi, Nicole. We just started.
Oh, great.
So you haven't really missed anything. Talking about the different kinds of light here. Can you see the screen? I'm sharing the screen here.
Yes, I can see it.
So I was talking about fog and mist is very interesting kind of light that can be sort of dramatic and mysterious. In New England, we have all sorts of kinds of weather and extremes of weather. And oftentimes going out on the worst kind of weather is the time you get the best shots. And finally, I'll talk a bit about night photography, some of the things we can get at night when the sun is no longer with us. So we're going to start off by talking about the golden hours. And this is the kind of picture you'll often see when people talk about the golden hours. This is the sunset or sunrise part of it, with the sun going down and coming through the thick atmosphere and maybe going through or illuminating clouds, getting this beautiful warm orange look. And people will often say this is the most beautiful time. You know me by now that one of the topics I always talk about is having context in your images. And I get frustrated when I see pictures like this because they're just kind of a smear of color across the screen. And it's pretty color, but it really doesn't tell much of a story. The only thing that partially saves it is this little seagull and this little boat, but that's really about it. In these sort of pictures, people often just let the color do the work for them in their picture, and people will look at this and ooh and ah about it. But to me, it doesn't really tell a story, and it doesn't go much beyond what you're seeing in terms of the colors. So you don't want your pictures looking into sunsets in particular as just being a smear across the frame. You want to find something interesting. Example of this was this evening in Chesterfield, looking out over the Vermont hills. I had run out because the sky was so dramatic. I got up there on the hillside by the road, and there was a couple other people shooting with their iPhones, amazed at the colors as they would be appropriately. There was some context in this image. We can see the hills kind of fading off going into Vermont, and you get this very interesting boiling kind of cloud cover in the distance, which is interesting. But I surprised the other people that were there because I looked at this, I got a couple of pictures, and then I left. And the reason that I left was that I knew that about a couple hundred yards down the road, there was this barn. And I know that I wanted to get something interesting in the foreground of the sky, so I went there and caught that. So again, you're putting context into your images of sunsets and sunrises. The other interesting thing about this, to make the point of the fact that it's important that you stay around after the sun has gone down when you're looking at a sunset, or be there before the sun comes up. Because oftentimes you get your prettiest skies after the sun has actually gone down below the horizon, because you don't have that sun glaring at you, just kind of taking over everything, but the sun is still illuminating the clouds above. So it's always good to hang around after the sun has gone down. When you take pictures of sunsets or sunrise, you want to look for foregrounds, look for context, excuse me. Here's another example of context. This is Nubble Light in York, Maine and Camp Nettic. And I came out early for sunrise, and I was disappointed because at sunrise, the sun was behind all these low clouds. But what happened is, just as the sun came up over the top of the clouds, it also came up over the top of the island. And I was able to catch it with the rays of sunlight coming down, and had nice color in the sky as well. So this worked out well. I was able to get the light in the lighthouse. Now, the problem with this is that the moment when the sun was right here cutting into the island was not a time when there was good surf in the foreground. And I wanted to get something interesting here. This was a very easy fix when you talk about using Photoshop, because I was able to take my picture of the sun cresting, and then over the next couple of minutes, take a lot of pictures of the surf crashing in, till I found one that I liked. And then I was able to take the two images and put them together. It was easy to put these together with this nice line across here, so that I can combine the two and get an interesting image. Again, having the sunrise, but also having interesting context. Is another example. Yes.
I'm sorry, could I ask a question about that last one? When you take the picture and you combine them, do you have to stand in the same spot to keep shooting images of the water? Like, after you got the sun the way you wanted it, did you have to stay in the same spot and get the water from the same?
Yeah, you want to be roughly in the same spot so the pictures will register. I mean, the best way to do this is to have your camera on a tripod.
Okay.
It's exactly in the same spot, and that's what I did here. I had it set up on the tripod.
Okay, thank you.
And then I could just shoot. And get a good tripod. This is a picture with the sunset and the nice fence and trellis in the foreground. This trellis was actually in a lot of shade, and I had to work a little bit in Photoshop to bring that up so that the shady areas became brighter. But again, context. Here's a Pacific coast off San Diego at a time of a sunset. The sunset was beautiful and the sky was nice, but I particularly liked the birds working on the shore. And so I really concentrated on that. And, if you think about the rule of thirds, my horizon line is about, a third of the way down here, like you would do with a rule of thirds. And so we're concentrating really on how the sun works across the waves and silhouettes nice birds working their way on the beach. Now, the thing about sunsets and sunrises is they're best when there's some clouds in the sky. But you don't obviously want so many that you can't see the sun. But if you got some cloud cover, it works much better because you want something for the sun to shine on. And this had nice cloud cover. You will have your mornings when you're disappointed. I got up early for this sunrise at Rye Beach, and there was very little, if any, clouds in the sky. So it was really rather uninteresting in the sky, even though we had a nice clear day and could see the sun shining through. Obviously, I had a small aperture because you can see all the starburst of the sun in the distance. So in this situation, I concentrated more on the foreground. Again, cutting it about a rule of thirds, and then just dealing with the curve of the coast here on this little tidal pool, and the seagrass, as well as the reflection off the barn, using the sun's light rather than actually what we saw in the sky. Another example, this is a breakwater in Menimsha on Martha's Vineyard, getting really a silhouette. Again, there wasn't a lot of clouds in the sky. It got red just before the sun went down, so I was able to get the foreground with the fishermen on the jetty.
Jeff, did you use a filter there?
No.
Okay.
When you're shooting directly into the sun is a time that I'll often take off all my filters, because there's a tendency to get flare. As many lenses or pieces of glass as you have between the sun and your sensor, they each are an opportunity for there to be internal reflections within the lens and getting kind of a flare look. So I'll often take the lens off. If I have a polarizer or something else, I'll just take it off briefly to take the picture when I'm shooting directly into the sun and then put it back on. But this isn't, the orange color is not the effect of any filter that I put on there. There's another one. This is one of the two twin lights on Thatcher Island off of Cape Ann. These are great old lighthouses. This is looking across the water to the island. Bright sun, not much cloud, but as it first came up, you got the nice orange across the water. And I particularly like the sun shining through the windows on the lighthouse. There's often a question when people are taking pictures of sunrises or sunsets about what the exposure should be. What's the correct exposure? And the answer really is that there's no absolute correct exposure. And you have some options with this. It depends on what you want to highlight. This is a picture of a sunset on Spofford Lake. Again, it's after the sun has gone down, but you see the light in the clouds here. And this is fairly dark so that we can see the sky more dramatically, the deeper blues and oranges, but you see almost nothing in the foreground of the trees and the distant part of the lake because of that exposure. Now you can increase the exposure and you can start to see some detail in the foreground here. But as you do that, you're going to start losing a little of the drama in the sky. And you can continue on with a greater exposure and a greater exposure to the point that you see a lot of detail in the foreground and the sky is really more washed out. So you have some choice about what you might want to do with that kind of with these kind of exposures. The other option is to take those 4 exposures that I just did and put them into Photoshop or Lightroom and do a high dynamic range image, which takes all 4 images and takes the full range, dynamic range, and puts it together. So it basically like squeezes the highlights and the shadows in so that you have a good look on both sides. You can get a picture like this, where you have the nice dramatic sky, but you can also see detail in the foreground. So again, this is something that you can do with digital photography that you could never do with film. Be able to get this compression of the dynamic range far beyond what you could get with a single image. So we often think about the golden hour as being the time of sunsets and sunrises and looking into the sun and seeing it in the sky. The other major part of this is just the quality of the light itself, not the actual sunset or sunrise. If you're taking a picture of, for example, of a sunset on a beach, you can turn around and you can see the beautiful warm light cast on everything around you. So something as ordinary as this collection of plants all of a sudden takes on a nice appearance just because of the warmth of the light. And taking advantage of that warm light is the second part of the excitement of shooting in the golden hour. It can give you kind of a false impression of warmth. This is on top of Mount Washington in March. I was up there for an overnight photography trip. And I got up in the morning and was out right after sunrise. You can see the moon over here in the distance, but it was right after sunrise. And there was this nice warm light on the snow. And you looking at this, you might not guess that the temperature was 20 degrees below zero and there was a 40-mile-an-hour wind. So the wind chill factor was 56 degrees below zero. Wouldn't guess it from looking at the light here. Are people familiar with this particular sugar house? One in Stoddard, I think it's on Route 9. I've been driving by this thing for years, and it keeps on swaying more and more. I'm sure that within a few years, it's just going to be a pile of loose lumber. But while you have a chance, you ought to go by and check it out. It's classic. And on this particular evening, I was coming back from Laconia, and I had to stop to take a picture with this light. Nice warm evening light. You can see how late we are in the evening with the shadows being projected from this tree across the top roof of the structure, and just beautiful, warm, pleasant light. Sometimes in these situations, you can get nice contrasting colors. This is an evening shot of motif number 1 in Rockport. Nice warm light on the structure, and cooler light in the shadows that makes a nice contrast between the two. I always like to throw this one in. It's a picture of an evening shot of a barn in Westmoreland, and the big bull here in the yard. Mostly I like this because the name of the bull is Gizmo, which I've always loved. But still, you get the nice light here. The light is good also for photography of people. This is Abby and Grayson, again in Martha's Vineyard in the Nimsha. In the evening light, the warm light really looks wonderful on the skin. Another example of the warm light, this of a tree in Walpole, on the old Walpole Road. And the thing I wanted to point out here is the sun is off to our right, and it's shining its golden light on the trees here. But the other thing you notice is the sky behind it is deep blue. And that's what you'll often see in these golden hour pictures. If you look away from the source of the light, away from the sun, the sky gets very blue. And it makes a nice contrast between the warm colors here and the blue sky. You can see the same thing here. This is a picture of Chesterfield's Town Hall. Nice warm light on the Town Hall from the setting sun, but also nice deep blue sky. Got the moon here, which adds something to it as well. So that's the contrast of complementary colors between the yellows and oranges and the deep blues. Here's an example. This is from the Cathedral of the Pines in Rindge, and you can see just a little residual orange light on the chapel, but most of the sky is turning blue. It still makes that nice contrast. And what this does is move us towards the next real topic here, and that is as we watch the sun set and the orange light begins to fade, you don't want to leave then either. You want to stick around, and you want to stick around for what we call the blue hour. As the sun sets, you don't see the yellow much anymore, but still there's light in the sky, and that light is reflected off the dome of the sky, and it comes down quite blue. So for a period of time before it gets very dark, you can see this wonderful blue light, just the opposite of the warm yellows that you had just a couple of minutes before. So it's an amazing change in the spectrum of light that you have on your subjects over just a few minutes as you go from the deep oranges to the nice deep cool blues. This is a farm in Westmoreland. And this is a house in Hinsdale, Route 63. Again, in the blue hour. You can tell that the sun is just going down because you can see the reflection of the sunlight off to our left still in the windows of the house. One day I was rushing to get to Washington, New Hampshire, to try to get some pictures of the sunsets, and I got there late, and I was disappointed. But then I realized, even though the sun was pretty much down, there was still some light on the buildings and this general blue hour effect that really made it look quite nice. The buildings in Washington, New Hampshire are really quite classic. There's several of them all arrayed on the top of the hill. And in fact, Washington, New Hampshire's center, town center, is by altitude the highest town center in New Hampshire. So it kind of gets the last light of every sunset. The trick about getting this picture is to get it when there aren't a bunch of police cars and other cars and trucks in front of these buildings. And I was able to get that on this occasion. Sometimes you'll have the blue hour, but you'll still have a little rim of the golden light as the sun goes down. That's nice. This combination of the golden light and the blue can be very effective. Again, complementary colors. You can see that when you talk about sort of artificial illumination. This is one of the last pumpkin festivals that we had, and a time when we had this big scaffold in Central Square. Sorry, Shelley, didn't have a chance ever to see this, but it was really remarkable. I always, on those occasions, tried to run to get to a position like this before everything got completely dark. And a lot of people just wait for it to get very dark, and then you just have the scaffold and maybe some light on the tree. But if you can catch it during the blue hour, it makes for a nice contrast and warmer light. That kind of contrast is also good if you're taking a picture of other lights, like city lights. This is Boston. And it's taken in the evening after the sun was completely down and after the blue hour was gone. And you've got the lights of the city, but there's such a big contrast between the bright lights and then everything else being dark that it's not very interesting. If you catch this same scene during the blue hour, it's much more effective. You get light on the things in the foreground, light on the buildings, but you still see the nice lights in the building shining through. So you get that nice blue. One of the classic times when the blue hour is good is when you're taking pictures of Christmas lights. This is a picture of Central Square in Keene with our regular Christmas tree, the nice church and the gazebo, but shot at a time when the light was really already completely dark, black. Compare that to shooting in the blue hour, when you can see all this nice blue coloration, and it just generally makes the whole picture look more balanced and interesting. Yes.
How did you not get any streaks?
Excuse me?
How did you not get streaks
Streaks where?
in your lighting? Like because you definitely have it on, you have it on a tripod for sure, right? And you have to have the aperture open quite a bit, right?
Well, no, you try to, again, we talked about trying to get the aperture smaller so you can get the lights on the trees to have that starburst look.
Uh-huh.
Plus, we'd like to have things in sharp focus from the tree all the way back, more or less, to the church. So I didn't have a big aperture.
Oh.
And I didn't need as much of a big aperture here because I had all this light in the sky already, so it wasn't completely dark. And the reason you don't see streaks is nothing's moving.
Mm.
When we see streaks, is nothing's moving. It's always kind of key to sit here. You know, I'm standing sort of at the tip of the head of the square here on Main Street, and you try to time it for when there are no cars coming by, because when the cars go by, you'll see streaks of light, or at least pieces of light. You try not to get cars in front, and you also try to not get them in the back. So you try to combine those two. So you don't have streaks unless there's movement. If there was snow falling, and I think in this is the picture where there was snow falling, but the exposure was long enough so that you don't see the snow. It just shows up as a little difference between the clarity of the tree versus the clarity of the church in the background, that you're seeing more snow in the way. This is what I often refer to as the holy grail of Christmas lights. You've got the blue hour, you've got nice bright lights, interesting context, and you have fresh snow on the ground. So the snow is on the branches, as you see. The only thing that would make this possibly better for Christmas lights is if you had Santa flying across the sky. My daughter always accuses me of sticking stuff like this in pictures, so I thought I would do that. Another situation where the blue hour can be very helpful is when you're taking pictures of the moon. AJ wants to take pictures of the moon.
Yeah.
This is the typical picture you see when people take pictures of the moon. And they'll aim their camera and shoot. The camera meter wants to make everything sort of middle gray. So it's trying to make this area brighter because it's just dark shadow. And by doing that, the moon just becomes this white nondescript disk with no detail. And I think I may have mentioned before that when you're exposing to see the detail in the moon, you have to remember that the moon is basically this big sand dune in the sky, which is reflecting light back from the sun directly. So if you want to expose for the moon, you have to expose the same way you would a beach on a sunny day. And when you do that, you can see detail in the moon. But now that we've done that, we're not going to see any of the stuff in the shadows because we've closed down the aperture so much to see the detail here that everything else is black. So there's that problem between the brightness of the moon and the darkness of the foregrounds. And if you want to get them both together, there's a problem. One thing you can do is take a picture in both situations and put them together. The other thing you can do is shoot this during the blue hour. During the blue hour, there's still light in the sky, so you can still see some illumination here of Mount Monadnock and the rising moon. And then you can find a setting where you can expose properly for the moon, but still see something in the foreground. The question is, when can you photograph the moon when it's in the blue hour? Most of the time when you look at the moon, it's just this disk in the black sky. The one time that the moon shows up in the blue hour, that is to say, the time right after the sun goes down, is with a full moon. That's whenever you have a full moon, it will occur, it will rise at the same time that the sun is setting. And you think about it, the full moon means the sun is shining directly on the moon straight from our viewpoint. And so it has to be directly opposite. And so whenever you see a full moon rising, the sun's going to be setting behind you. And that's the situation where you'll still have the blue hour. So shooting full moons are always interesting and nice, but particularly because you can get some detail in the foregrounds because of the residual blue light. And you see that in various pictures. This is another one taking a picture rising over Monadnock. Monadnock is the obvious choice for something to put in the field when you're looking at the moon rising. Here was rising into a bit of cloud, but you can still see it nicely. This was the moon rising, the harvest supermoon, actually, during one of my foliage workshops. And it just happened to be that we had that moon rising. So we were able to get across Spofford Lake, a look across the lake, see the moon rising when there was still a blue hour, and still some nice golden light on the foliage in the foreground as well. Now, one of the problems that we have in taking pictures of the moon during the blue hour is that when the moon rises, we don't see it right away here because it has to get up above the hills. And sometimes if the moon is oriented so it's getting up over some tall hills, by the time it shows up, the sun has already gone down so much that the sky may not have residual blue in it. It might be pretty dark. So you have to kind of find a place where you can still see it coming up. My friends on the seacoast don't have that problem because the moon is, you can see the moon right away as soon as it comes up. I was on the Connecticut coast some years ago and had a chance to get the picture of a supermoon rising over the Saybrook breakwater. Again, it was easier to get it because you could see the moon rising right at the same time as the sun was going down. You actually had to wait a little bit because the sky wasn't as nice blue as you would have liked. We'll talk about how you get the moons to look so big against the foregrounds here in a minute. But just want to reiterate the fact that the full moon is when you can see it in the blue hour, and it's another reason to watch for it. So the golden hours are a great time to shoot. You've got beautiful golden light. It can be soft and interesting. Some things to think about, obviously, is first add context to your images so that you have interest. I talk about this all the time during the course about trying to add context to your images. Use the warm light so you're not only looking into the sunset, but you're also looking behind you at how the light plays on the landscape and adds interesting tones and soft character to the images. And you don't want to miss the blue hour. Hang around for the blue hour after the fact, just to get that nice contrast. And you can experiment with exposure, as we saw, to get different appearances and different things, whether you want to highlight primarily the deep sky, or you want to make sure that you get a lot of detail on the foregrounds, you can experiment or even take multiple exposures and put them together. So a lot you can do with the golden hour. Now, opposite from the golden hour, this wonderful time to shoot, is bright, sunny midday sun days. And photographers will always tell you that this is the worst time to shoot pictures. Problems include the harsh shadows between the lights and the darks, which means you have very stark contrast. So you have dark areas and very bright areas. What that means is you have a big dynamic range from brights to darks, which is hard to capture in one picture. You can't seem to get it all in. Also, the bright sun tends to reflect off foliage, leading to some obscuration of the colors of the foliage. Look at the leaves over here, and you see no color in them at all because the sunlight is just coming off reflecting off the foliage and shining into the camera. So it's a tough time to shoot. This is, by the way, Madame Cherie's castle. Is everyone familiar with that? How many people have been there? Interesting place in Chesterfield. This was a sort of a party house for a woman back in the 20s. There's a long history about it. You can look it up on my blog. This is about all that's really left of her house, her castle, this long spiral staircase. And it may not be there that long either. These arches, as you can see, are beginning to slip, and they've slipped considerably more since this picture. We try to keep people from climbing on the stairs, but eventually these arches are going to fall. So you want to get out there and get a picture of the arches while you still can. But you may not want to picture them during this bright sunny weather. There are problems with it. And there are difficulties with this kind of light, to the point that if we talk about the golden hour, I often refer to this as the lead hours, time in midday. So what's the solution to this sort of situation? A lot of photographers will tell you the best solution is to go back to bed and get up at sunset, or maybe go back to your office and work on your pictures, but don't try to go out and shoot during this kind of light. And I used to think that way. And then something occurred to me, and I like to refer to it as the beautiful sunny day paradox. People who are not photographers will come up to you and say, boy, that was a beautiful sunny day today. You must have gotten some great pictures. And we kind of scoff at them and say, you know, these people don't know anything, because they don't know that that's the worst time to go out on a bright sunny day because of all the problems we talked about. But for some reason, they think it's a beautiful time to go shoot. And the question is why? And I think it's because the contrast between the lights and the dark become very interesting and beautiful. And where there's not a lot of reflection off of the foliage, it can really bring it out and have it pop. So the real problem with bright sunny days isn't that they are not beautiful. The real problem is that the media that we have has difficulty capturing it. It has trouble capturing the broad contrast in the lights on a sunny day, and also has difficulty cutting through the glare that comes off the foliage. So it really isn't the day, it's our ability to capture it that's the problem. So what I would say is stop whining about the terrible light and start figuring out ways to push the limitations of our medium so that it can capture what other people see as such beautiful times. So that's what we'll talk about now. My favorite thing about sunny days is to lie in the shade. And I lie in my hammock here and just kind of enjoy the light. I'd like to take pictures like this so I can see detail in the shade, but also see some detail in the highlights in the bright light. Big dynamic range between the two. But if you can record both of those, you can get a beautiful picture even when it's bright and sunny. So there's a couple of ways of getting at that. The first way is to take a well-exposed picture that doesn't blow out the highlights or muddy up the shadows into software. You want to shoot it in RAW so you have more range of what you can do with it. And then you can take a picture maybe with a histogram that looks like this, and you can save the highlights and salvage the shadows, kind of move everything together so that you can get it all in one image. The other thing you can do is take multiple exposures and use high dynamic range photography, HDR photography, to move that all together with a range of photographs rather than trying to push one to get what you want to see. Now, if you're looking at kind of a small area on a sunny day, there's a number of things you can do. You can fill the shadows. You can't do this obviously in a big landscape, but if you're looking closely, you remember I used the fill flash to take a picture of Tim at the Chesterfield anniversary to soften the shadows on one side of his face. You can also use reflectors. See that as well. Reflectors to reflect the light back into someone's face. You can also, by the way, take a diffuser that's, instead of reflecting light, you can take a large sort of translucent disc that will take the bright sunlight and diffuse it over a larger area. The thing that makes bright sunlight harsh is the fact that the source of the light is very small in the sky. So small sources of light tend to come down and cause harsh, sharp shadows, whereas a larger surface of light actually causes much softer shadows, so that you can take a picture of something. Again, he has to be close. You can't put a diffuser up in front of a landscape, but you can put it up in front of a flower or something of that sort and get softening of the light in that situation. You can also shoot in the shade, which works well with the scene. Yeah.
Call from.
Turn that off. This is a typical situation that I always used to run into when I was shooting film. I was very frustrated. It was a bright sunny day, and take a picture down the road here. And with film and also with digital, you have the same problem. It's hard to be able to get everything well exposed. You could expose for the shadows like this and see the shadows nicely in the image, but then the background here in the sunny areas get all blown out. Your other option would be to expose for the bright areas, and then your shadows get lost. And when shooting with film, I really had to pick one or the other. I had to decide what was more important, the highlights or the shadows, because I couldn't get both. Now, nice thing with digital now, we can get both, move this wide dynamic range together and get around the trouble with the bright sunny day thing here. So the same picture with just one image that was well balanced, I was able to go into Lightroom. And again, I'm not teaching you Lightroom here, but I wanted to just give you a rough idea. You bring the image in, and then you have individual controls of highlights and shadows, whites and blacks. So in this picture, I could darken the highlights, this slider all the way to the left, so you could see into the highlights here. And I could lighten the shadows so I could see into the shadow areas. And you get a picture that's much more balanced. If you bring that picture into Photoshop, you can do some more fine adjustments, and you can go from those two extremes into a picture that looks to me very much like what I saw when I looked down the road. Again, that's the advantage of shooting digitally, to be able to bring it into some software and make some fairly simple changes in order to salvage this kind of thing. The other approach to this high contrast situation on sunny days is to use high dynamic range imagery. Now, I did this picture to demonstrate that in a blog, and so I took a lot of pictures. I normally don't need more than a few, but this I took 6 pictures, going from a very bright image with the shadows well seen, and then getting darker and darker to the point that the highlights are the area that gets well seen. And then it's the simple thing with this is you take all these pictures, highlight them, go into the menu, select photo merge, hit HDR, and it does it for you. It takes all those 6 pictures and turns it into a picture that has nice exposure of the shadows as well as the highlights. It's compressing that dynamic.
Just one sec. Is it in the camera, or do you have to buy software for this?
This is software. Although some of the newer cameras actually have the ability to do this in camera. The trouble with doing it in camera is that the camera decides how to put the pictures together. But some cameras will, if you hit the shutter, it'll go click, 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 and take a number of different pictures automatically at different levels and combine them within camera. So some cameras do that. I don't like using that because I like to have more control of what you get when you move it into software. So to get this result, I'm not a gigantic fan of using HDR, particularly given the control we have now over images, even looking at a single image. When I look at pictures like this, to me, they look a little bit too processed. I kind of think of it as looking a little too cooked, so that the appearance of the shadows and the highlights don't look quite natural. You can do the same sort of thing with just one image and make the kind of adjustments that I showed you before, and you can get a picture like this with one image, still balancing pretty well between shadows and highlights, although I think looking a little more natural. The other advantage of taking only one picture as opposed to a series of pictures to do high dynamic range is that when you take multiple pictures, you get into trouble if things are moving. Most typically, if you're taking a picture like this, if you took those 6 pictures, the leaves are going to be moving in between each picture. And so sometimes the software has trouble deciding what it's going to show. And you can get something like this. This is just the result of a 3-image combination, HDR and tone map. And you can see it all kinds of looks fuzzy. You just take one of those images and process it. You don't get this ghosting. You get a much more defined picture. So one of the disadvantages with HDR is that you can get this kind of effect when there's movement. Works better if everything is very still. And again, I talked about using fill flash. Remember they had Tim and had used the flash to fill the shadow here. You can also use a reflector, as I said. These look like these, and I don't know if you can see this. I have this reflector. It has a gold surface and a silver surface, and it packs down like this, but when you close it, it's this big. So if you often need someone to help you to shine this in the face of someone, and then you need to figure out how to fold it back so it goes back into its original shape, which I'm getting better at. And these come in all sizes, and they have different surfaces. This one also has a big diffuser. I can just remove the reflector portion, and inside is a diffuser. So these can work to equalize the light in areas where you have a small area. You can also use a diffuser, which is kind of like applying shade to a local area of an image. And I have a small diffuser. It's about this big that I can carry in my camera bag easily. Picture of this flower with direct sunlight. You can see the harsh shadows here and reflection. If you put this diffuser in front of the light, you change that bright point source of light to a bigger area, put it as close as you can to the flower so it's relatively bigger, and you get this look. So much better appearance in the bright sunlight. Secret about this is if you're going to use a diffuser, you want to make sure that the diffuser covers everything you see in the image. You don't want hot spots in the background. A little suggestion of that here, but you want to make sure it covers all the area that's in your picture. Now, going from beyond just a little diffuser you can hold in your hand, another way that works basically through the same system is by just shooting in the shade. If it's a bright sunny day, get in shade and shoot. And then you go from having a bright light shining on your images to having the light coming from the whole dome of the sky, which is really kind of a perfect softbox, a nice, even, wide source of lighting. And you can get pictures like this, even though it's sunny around you. That's often good for taking pictures of like macros. This is a bud on our tulip tree in our yard. And it's good for portraits. And I showed you this picture of Abigail before on a sunny day here under the trees. You get nice soft light. So getting in the shade can help with a bright sunny day. The other problem with bright sunlight is the reflections, as I talked about. Here you have an example of these leaves with a bright sunlight shining on it, and you don't see the real deep green. What you see is the reflected sunlight. Here you have light coming in one direction from the sun, and it bounces off everything and comes right into the camera, and you get the reflection. The way to deal with this is using a polarizing filter. the polarizer actually is able to be turned so that it can cut out certain orientations of light. And you can turn the filter, it has an external ring, such that it blocks off that portion of the light which is reflecting directly off your subject. And you can go from this to this with the polarizer. Really looks right through the glare. It really does, it really is a remarkable thing, how it works. Another classic example of this sort of effect is looking into water. This is Tucker Brook in Milford, New Hampshire. And you can just see the reflection of the sunlight on the brook. You put the polarizing filter on and you cut through it right like that. It does an amazing job. Here's another example. These maple leaves have a reflection of the light. The light source is over to the right here. And you can see there's a lot of reflection off the leaves. And if you put the polarizer on, you're able to cut through that nicely and you see the color coming through. So you use the polarizer in that situation. This illustrates a couple of things. First of all, the polarizing filter is the one filter whose effect cannot be fully duplicated in editing software. Lots of other things like making things dark or light or bringing out in certain colors can be duplicated in software. But there's no software that can duplicate the ability of a polarizer to cut this kind of reflection. So it's the one essential filter that you ought to have in addition to something like a UV filter or a clear filter just to protect the lens. The other thing is that polarizing filters work best when the sun is coming at 90 degrees, when it's off to the side. There is very little effect of the polarizer if you're looking into the sun or if the sun's directly behind you. And the polarizing effect becomes greater and greater as you move from, let's say, directly in front of you over to the side. And there's a gradient of effect as you go that way. So that can be a problem when you're shooting a wide angle lens. This is a picture of lupins during the Sugar Hill Lupin Festival up in Franconia. You can see Franconia Notch here. This is Mount Lafayette. This is Cannon Mountain. Nice wide angle. I think I use my wide angle lens to get all these in here. And that looks well. The problem that you see is look at the difference in the darkness of the sky over here on the right compared to on the left. And that's because the polarizing effect, the polarizer that I had on the camera, the polarizing effect is very little when I'm looking off to the left, more or less directly where the sun's coming from, and then gets more and more prominent as you move away more towards right angle. And you can get into this problem, particularly when you have a wide angle lens, because then you're going to see the gradient. Now, some people don't have any real trouble with the way this looks. I don't like it. I think it looks unnatural. So there's a couple of things you can do. The first of all is don't use a polarizer, or I'll often turn back the strength of the polarizer a bit so it's not so strong, so you don't see quite the same gradient. The other thing is not to use a wide angle lens. If we had the lens maybe at half that width, say cutting it right here, we wouldn't see as big a gradient and it wouldn't be as much of an issue. So that's something you can do. The other thing you can do is go into software. This has got a nice sharp edge for the sky. And what I can do is I can apply a gradient of brightness. I can make everything brighter and then make a gradient so that the brightening effect is minimal here and gets more as we come across, basically counteracting the gradient going the other way before. When you do that, it would cause everything in the picture to have that gradient of brightness. But instead, what I do is I select just the sky and then apply the gradient just to the sky. And you can get a picture that looks like this to look like that. You've gotten rid of that gradient, although the sky isn't as blue as it was over here. So this is another way of dealing with it. It doesn't affect the gradient that you see in the hills back here, but I don't think that's as prominent. So it's always something to think about when you use a polarizer. Be careful when you're using a wide angle if you open it up way wide, because it's going to cause this kind of problem. Now, oftentimes when people think about polarizers, they think about what the effect it has on skies, the ability to turn blues very dark and make clouds really stand out. And it's a beautiful effect that is quite striking. I think that the biggest effect really is the way it can cut through the glare, particularly on these bright sunny days, and it allows the color of foliage to come through without the problem with reflections. So they're both important, but I think this is what's particularly special. Here's another example of that. This is a maple tree on a Stonewall Farm in Keene in the evening in the autumn. And you can see it's got some nice color in there, but there's also some reflection of the light coming from the left over here. If you put a polarizer over this, you go from this to this. Just turns on the color electrically. It also darkens the sky, as we talked about, but to me, the big effect is going from that.
Jeff, do you have a polarizer with you right now? I don't even know what it looks like.
It looks like just a regular filter. The only difference is it looks, someone's going to pull one out. It's a regular filter. The difference is when you put it on, and it's tight, it has an additional screw in the front so it can go around and around so that you can turn it to the point. You can look through the viewfinder and see when you've adjusted it to the point that it's
Okay.
a maximum effect.
All right.
In that case,
Okay.
it looks fairly dark. And one of the things about a polarizer, it may take a stop or two off of your shooting. So you need to have a longer exposure or wider aperture to use it in the same situation.
You were also talking about the wide angle lens. Isn't there a problem with the wide angle lens that the ends come out curved? What do you do with that?
If you have a very big wide angle lens, you can get some curve, but I use 16 millimeters. My widest wide angle lens goes to 16 millimeters, and that's generally not a problem.
So 16 or 60?
16.
1/6.
1/6.
Okay.
You can get different lenses have different effects of curving. Some are more linear wide angles. You can correct that easily again in software. But you're right. If you get it very wide angle, almost like a fisheye, then you can get some curvature like that.
Okay.
Okay. So polarizers help with reflection. The other way to deal with the bright sunny weather is to glory in it, to use the bright light. The classic example for me is using transillumination, shining the light through foliage so that it turns on almost electrically. Here with the sunflower. Another example here with the Academy building, now the Historical Society in Walpole, in a spring day with the light shining through the foliage. Light shining through foliage can really turn on the color in foliage. This is an early fall picture. The leaves weren't all that far turned, but by looking through them with the light coming through, they really looked much more bright than they would have otherwise if you looked at them from the other side. Here's another example of the light shining through the foliage. This is one of my favorite autumn pictures and includes both the sun shining through the leaves and also some of the shadow here in the shade where the colors come through. So just using the light in that fashion can allow you to get all sorts of interesting pictures. And on a bright sunny day, one of the first things I'm looking for is things that I can see have the sun shine through to make impressive photos. So let's go back to finish up on bright light to this arch, the Madame Cherie arch in the terrible lead hour. Not much you can do with this to make it look decent. You can put the polarizer on and get maybe through some of this. But the other thing you can do, and I did in this situation, was just walk around to the other side of the arch and look back. And when you do that, you can get this. You get the light shining through the trees, the nice transilluminant foliage. You get the light shining through the arches, and enough light coming through so that the shadows back here can be illuminated, and you can actually get some shine coming up so that you can see the bricks. So you have a situation that was very stark with high contrast, evening out quite nicely. So it's all a matter of using the bright light in the right ways. We talk about one of my favorite kind of lights, which is overcast light. This is a Portland headlight. And this picture was done on a cloudy, overcast day and illustrates some of the advantages of overcast light. First of all, the light does not come from a single source, it comes from the entire sky. So again, it's like a big softbox. And with that big source of light, you don't get a lot of deep shadows. You don't get reflections because the light's not coming from one particular area. So the colors come through nicely. You get rich colors, which shine out without obscuring reflections. And the sky often can be quite interesting and moody, as we'll talk about. You have to do something sometimes to see that. Probably the most important thing about overcast light is that you don't have to get up before dawn to see it. One of my happiest things when I get up, my clock goes off early in the morning because I want to go out and see the sunrise. I'll look outside. If I see an overcast day for a second, I'll say, oh, geez, I'm not going to be able to see the sunrise. And then I'll say, okay, but I can go back to sleep. And I go back to sleep. Because overcast light really is about the same no matter when you get it. You don't have to get up early in the morning to see it. So that's a big advantage. The overcast light leads to softness, soft shadows. So you can get rich here, like this kind of rich buttery look to the foliage. It's also good for portraits. Again, no sharp shadows. People aren't squinting into the bright light. So nice soft light in this situation as well. One of my favorite times to shoot an overcast light is fall foliage. People will often say, it was a bright, beautiful day. You should go out and shoot foliage. And again, there are ways of dealing with bright sunny days. But the best time to go out and see the foliage is when you don't have reflection of bright light coming off the leaves, where you can see into the deeper color. So overcast days are often the best time to shoot fall foliage. See other examples of this. Again here, nice contrast with the reds. Now, it's also true that overcast light is good for our what I call our second autumn, which is the spring. And right about now, it's beginning to fade, but right about now, as the leaves first come out, they usually come out in this wide array of different colors, which are fascinating and really look best if the light is overcast. Very soon, and it's happening already now, these leaves will start all looking the same. There's, I think, a certain kind of deep photosynthetically optimal green that they'll all go to. But in the early spring for a week or two, you get all these beautiful different colors. It's worth getting out to shoot. Another example of the early spring here at Rhodes End Farm. Another thing that can be very good in overcast light is waterfalls. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first one is that when you have overcast light, everything is a bit darker. And when it's darker, you can use longer exposures to see the kind of softness in the water. And I like to have long exposure to see this soft, almost cotton candy look. Some people don't like it. My wife doesn't like it, but I think it really is a nice way to show the movement in the waterfalls, and it's very dramatic. That's hard if things are very bright, because there's only so far you can stop down and have a shutter speed which is long enough to be able to catch the water moving. The other advantage of overcast light is that you don't have hot spots. And when you're taking a picture of a waterfall on a sunny day, it may be under foliage, but there's usually light coming through, and you'll have little areas that are very bright, break through the foliage. And that's very hard to expose properly for if you're trying to get a long exposure to see the water moving, and then you have a hot spot that's going to be totally blown out when you have these long exposures. So that's the other reason why overcast light is best for waterfalls. Sadly, this would normally be about the time that I'd be taking people out for my spring waterfall workshop weekend, but the pandemic's still cutting into that sort of thing. But this is a good time to go out and see the flowing water. Now, this waterfall was quite dramatic, and it's on the Catspain Brook in West Chesterfield. I was taking a picture downstream from this of the brook, and I just looked through and I saw this water, a portion of this waterfall, and I bushwhacked up the side and saw this scene. What this is an old mill dam, and the mill pond was full and coming over the top. It was like our own little Niagara Falls. It was remarkable. I had never known that this was here. And I came back a couple of times to catch it. But what happened quite soon is I think someone here who owned the property around it realized that having this big mill pond was a liability because of the risk that it might suddenly break and flood out people downstream. And so they ended up opening the spillway that was here and bypassing the pond. So we no longer had this water coming over the top. So sadly, you can't see this right now, although I keep on driving by hoping someone's sort of accidentally floated a mattress into the sluway to get this thing working again. This is the way the falls looks now. This is the top of the waterfall that you saw, and you can see the water shooting through down below, so that the pond never has a chance to build. Overcast light can be good on snowy days because you don't get such bright reflections off the snow. You can look into the textures of the snow better. In this situation with Whetstone Brook coming through Brattleboro, you can also see the moving water nicely. Now, overcast light is great. One of the major problems with overcast light is the sky. When you're taking pictures like this is the covered bridge in Dummerston on the West River. You're taking pictures like this, if you expose here for the foreground, the sky itself just gets washed out. Just kind of a uniform gray or light blue, and is very uninteresting and makes detracts really from the quality of the image. You can take a couple approaches to this. One of them is just to eliminate the sky, to frame your picture so you don't see much sky in it, and you can look more at the foregrounds, which can be interesting. Another example of this is the Stone Arch Bridge in Stoddard with just a little bit of sky in the top here. Oftentimes I'll go into the point that you see no sky at all. And this works very well. And you see you got the nice foliage here because of the nice overcast light. And you get to situations like this where I wanted to get a picture from the composition wise so that I could get this full sweep of the trees coming up here. But when you do that, it means you're going to include a big piece of this dull, uninteresting sky. Got nice foliage here, but the sky itself is just kind of washed out. So you can't really eliminate the sky without cutting into the composition that I wanted to get. Is there anything you can do with the sky? And here we bring the picture into the software. And here in Lightroom, like I showed you before, I was able to bring the highlights way down so that you can start seeing that the sky isn't a uniform, uninteresting thing, but actually has some interesting texture to it. You can actually take this image and then move it into Photoshop and do even more with the sky. And you can get something like this, going from this kind of sky to this, which is underneath it. And you actually bring out the sky so it becomes an interesting part of the image. Mm-hmm. Now, I did this in a blog to just demonstrate how you could do this, and so therefore I kind of overdid it more than you might normally do with the sky like this. Most of the time when I do this on overcast days, I'll just make it a more subtle change, so you can see something interesting in the sky, and it's not just such a blank slate for you. One of my students a few years ago, Rachel Sperling, had this nice picture of the Crawford Path in the White Mountains. Had two problems. One, the foreground was kind of dark, and the other was you had this flat, uninteresting sky in it. So as a demonstration for her, I worked on it a little bit in Lightroom and Photoshop. First of all, I was able to brighten up the foreground. This, by the way, is Mount Washington in the distance. And then with the sky, I was able to darken it. And then you have a much more interesting and powerfully dramatic image for your overcast day. So overcast light, a great time to get out there. Don't think that, it's because the clouds are overhead, that's not a time you want to go out. It's one of your better times to shoot.
Did you have to cut that?
Excuse me?
Did you have to cut through the mountains like that to do the two different ones? I mean, to do the, I mean, when I've used the Photoshop, well, the thing I have, it's either everything or it's either everything. It's pretty much everything.
Yeah,
So-
with Lightroom and now with Photoshop, actually with Lightroom now you can do it. You can actually select out a portion of the image.
Oh, yeah.
And here you can select out along here along the sky. And then you can make your changes to the sky independent of the changes you make in the foreground.
So you are cutting it out pretty much. You're doing it, I mean, you're not cutting it, but you're
called-
having to sort of cut it out.
Yeah, in Photoshop, it's called making a selection of a portion of the image. And you can have that selection set up and then you can apply changes with that, with only that selection being affected.
Okay.
You can put them together like that. And it's fairly easy to make that kind of selection given the sharpness of this edge all the way across. Sometimes it's harder, but there are ways to do that too. So let's talk about fog and mist, another favorite time for me to shoot. When I wake up in the morning and I look outside and it's deep fog, I'm anxious to get out quickly because oftentimes the fog will disappear as the sun gets higher in the sky. And I love to get out there and take advantage of the soft, moody light that you get on foggy, misty days. And on foggy days, you get soft, moody, mysterious light. It turns all the bright colors to soft pastels and enhances the sense of depth as you have parts of the image that are closer to you being fairly sharp and then fading off, becoming softer and softer as you get off to the distance. So you get this nice palpable feeling of depth in your images. And finally, the misty weather also makes the light palpable, and I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. But let's look at a nice foggy day. This is on Eden Pond in Eden, Vermont, up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And there's just this rolling fog on the pond itself. Again, trying to get something of interest of context, I wanted to wait until this cottage across the lake was clearer. And so I waited until there was a break in the fog before I took the picture and got this sort of interesting photo with the colors kind of shining through softly, but the cottage being more distinct. So the idea of having something distinct in an image, to me at least, is a key part of how you want to deal with foggy pictures. This first picture is of horses in a field in Marlborough. And it's interesting, it's nice and soft, but you can notice it looks pretty flat. The horses here, the trees all look about the same in terms of how distinct they are. You get up high, you begin to see a little bit more definition in the trees up here as we're getting sort of above the fog. But the main area of interest here is pretty much all the same. What I did in this situation was then walk closer to the horses and got this picture. Now the horses are really better defined. The background trees are pretty much the same, looking still foggy, but this gives a much better sense of depth and interest when you have, again, something in the foreground which is sharp. And that's the thing you want to look for when you talk about foggy days. That same day, I just backed away from the horses who were still here at the fence, now looking in the fog. And my area of sharpness is this interesting fence that was closer in. One of my favorite examples of this kind of effect is this picture that I took in the morning fog in Stonington, Maine. These lobstermen were kind of in an array, seeming quite sharp here in the foreground. That sharpness is enhanced by the bright color of the lobster pots. And then in a nice gradient, as you move away out into the harbor, they become softer and softer. I like the fact that there's a nice diagonal in this image. I think it adds a good deal to the power of the composition. And it's handy that the other two boats in the image don't overlap anything. I tried to arrange it so you wouldn't see that. So again, using the fog, showing depth by having something sharp in the foreground. You got to have animals in the field, and this is in Hubner Farm. As some of you know, I forget the Schott Hubner Farm. This is in Chesterfield, and getting your cattle in the field. Again, having one cow in the foreground being sharp, and then you can see the gradient as you go out into the fog. I always like to show this because I really like it. Some people don't get impressed by this, but I love the fact that in this picture of the fog on a beach in Nova Scotia, you can see the water lapping up on the beach nice and sharp, and then things get soft as you go out into the fog. And then there's this surprise pop-up cottage up on a high hill, which is just above the fog. And it's kind of a double depth of field kind of image. And this is a Stonewall Farm in Keene, again, looking off on an autumn picture with the fence going off in the distance, getting soft, using these diagonal lines. Now, sometimes you're not in the fog, but you're above it. This is a shot that I took on my way to Peacham, Vermont. I got up early to try to get to Peacham for the sunrise. And I almost didn't stop here because I was trying to rush to get to the village in time for the sun to come up. But I'm glad I stopped because it was my best picture of the day, just looking out over the fog, sitting in the valleys, and with the orange sky already beginning to show, with the contrast of orange and blue being quite striking. I finally got to Peacham, and Peacham was all in the fog, so I did get some kind of foggy pictures here. The cows in the foreground, the sugar shack in the background. Interesting. As I was driving away from this down the road, I looked behind me in the rearview mirror, and I saw this. And this is what I mean about seeing light, about light being palpable. When you have a foggy, misty day, you can see the rays of light coming through it if the sun is up. And on a foggy day, before the sun actually melts the fog away, you can catch scenes like this. The key to having this is always to have something blocking the bright disk of the sun, so it just doesn't overwhelm anything or everything, and you can see these rays coming through the various branches. Here's another example of that sort of effect. Again, with the sun being blocked, you can see the rays shooting through. This is in a back road in Duvers. And finally, the other way you can see misty light, if you will, is when the mist forms little water droplets and allows you to really see a nice spider web showing up. If you look closely, you'd see pearls of water droplets on all of these pieces of the web. New England is notable for its weather, extremes of weather, rain, snow, thunderstorms, and also seeing interesting things at the edges of storms. This is an example of a thunderstorm. This is lightning lighting up the clouds of a storm looking up the West River from Brattleboro. I was actually at the marina in Brattleboro, and I left my group and stood outside trying to catch the lightning shooting. This is an example of thunderstorms. It's also an example of a picture at the edge of the storm. The storm wasn't here, but I could see the edge of the storm in the distance, and that's often a striking way to shoot stormy weather in New England. So mostly what we see is rain, and we see snow in New England. In terms of rain, it's very much like the way you shoot overcast weather. The clouds are pretty much the same, and you get that same sort of soft light. The difference is that you can sometimes see glistening of the raindrops on the foliage. And if you're looking at a body of water, you may see the raindrops on that. You seldom see the rain actually falling, coming down, unless it's really heavy with big drops. But you just see this kind of setting. The difference with snow is notable because when you have snow falling, you can see the flakes coming down. They're big, they're slower coming down, and you can usually see them. And how you photograph them, particularly in terms of the shutter speed, can make a big difference in how they look in the final image. Let's look at raindrops first. And this is just another example, another overcast day, nice light, nice color in the fall foliage. And the raindrops, this is on the Ashwellet River, but nice raindrops on the river itself. You can see the water on the foliage, which can be interesting and cause a glistening effect. If you look really close at some of these drops, you can actually use them as a lens. In the situation, I'm looking at a small raindrop hanging, and you can look through it and you can see it's lensing. You can see the pine tree here and some other trees on the side, all upside down and backwards, but it works sort of like a lens, and it's kind of fun to look for.
What lens did you use for this one?
I think it was my 100mm macro lens, so I could get close enough. You got to get really close to see this effect. You can do some fun things with rain. This was a particularly heavy rainy day. I'd been to the dump and I just went down the road and saw one of my favorite barns. And I just stopped the car, turned off the wipers, and then took sort of abstract pictures of the rain as it came down in sheets on the windshield. So lots of fun you can do with rain. The problem with rainy days often is protecting your equipment. Cameras don't like getting wet, and the more expensive cameras have better weatherproofing, but all cameras can be affected by water getting into the mechanism, so you have to be careful with it. Usually when I go out and there's just a little bit of rain, what I will do is take something about the size of a dish towel that I can put over the camera as I'm walking around, and then I can just take it off briefly, take my picture, and then cover it up again, often using the towel to wipe off any moisture that's on it. If the rain gets hardy, you may need to think of other solutions if you're going to have to be outside. And you can buy things like this. This is the Kata cover. And Kata makes great stuff. They're an Israeli company, I'm sure, and they do a remarkable job. This is a great cover. You got 2 sleeves for your hands. You can get in here and work all the controls. Typically, these kind of covers have an opening that can wrap around the viewfinder, so you're looking through there, and then they come right out to the end of the lens, so you can shoot and keep the camera nice and dry. $75 is not a bad price for this kind of thing. It's probably more now. This was from a few years ago. You don't have to spend that amount of money to protect the camera, however. You can use a trash bag. This is a kitchen-sized trash bag. About 20 cents, I figured. And what you do is you put the bag, basically it's going to be over the camera. You make a small circular hole in one side of the bottom of the bag so that you can push the lens through it, and then use a rubber band to keep it tight at the end so that the only thing pointing out is the sun shield. And by the way, you want to use a sun shield in the rain in order to keep the raindrops off the surface. Whenever you're walking around with a camera, you want to always think about not pointing it up in the air. You want to keep it down as you're moving around so the rain doesn't get in and hit the filter that you have in here. With this sort of thing, it's all covered. You just kind of pick this up and get your head underneath, take your picture and put it back down, and it works well. You can walk around with this, with it nicely covered. So again, snow is different, because you can see the snowflakes. Here are the folks at Rhodes End Farm going out to feed the horses on a snowy day. And if you have a fast shutter speed, you can catch the snowflakes as kind of little dots. And you can see it here, that that's sort of a little dotting throughout the image. If you take a slower shutter speed, then the snow coming down will appear as streaks. And to some degree, that depends on how fast the snow is falling, which is related to the wind going as well. This is
What's the shutter speed you use for falling snow?
It depends on the weather, how fast the wind is blowing. You have to kind of experiment.
The reason I'm asking is I'm seeing these flowers actually coming out of the tree now. So, you know, when you see these petals coming down, I want to take photographs, but I'm not too sure what speed we need to take.
You mean the petal is falling down?
Yeah.
Yeah, again, it depends on how fast it's falling, and that'll depend on whether there's wind and also how big the petal is, how much it's hitting the air. So you have to experiment some if you want. If you want to experiment, I mean, first of all, if you're going to have a really long exposure, you're going to have a really small aperture or something of that sort.
Okay.
And if you're going to catch it, probably even at your slowest exposure, you're only going to catch it moving just a short distance.
Okay.
Fast. With snow, it can move faster. And this was a windy day with the snow being shot, you can see it's going down like this. These horses may look miserable, but I will tell you that this was the first snow of the season. They were fascinated, and the barn was right here off the right-hand side, so they didn't have to be out in the snow. They could have gone into the barn. So get off my back about this, about the horses. They were happy. But you can see the difference in effect, and this was just a longer exposure, so that you see the streaking of the snow. Very different look between the two. I'll show you another example of that. This was a real blizzard that I went out to shoot. And the wind was really going pretty good. This was a 90th of a second. And you can see, I hope you can see that the snow is streaking in this direction here, causing streaks. And you can see them along the side of the tree here at a 90th of a second. Shooting at 1/250th of a second, you see an entirely different look. Here you can see the snowflakes almost again as spots. It almost looks like a pointillistic painting rather than the streaks, and a different appearance and a different mood in the image. So it all depends on the shutter speed, and I can't tell you what the exact shutter should be because again, it depends on the size of the snowflakes, which means how fast they're falling, and also whether they're being blown. Okay. Now, another thing about shooting snowflakes is shown in this picture. This was kind of the first snowfall of the year, and I stopped to catch it, this little squall coming through on Route 9 in Keene. Can anyone see the problem in this picture?
Yep. There's reflection of lights around over there on snowflakes.
Reflection of lights.
On snowflakes. You look around to the
Splotchy.
I heard.
yeah, if you look at the very top of the mountain and if you look at the left-hand corner area,
Up
it looks a
here?
little distorted. I think it's blown up because of the light.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah, this area. Just above that, yeah.
Yeah, there is a little vignetting here.
Yeah.
Did I hear someone say blotching?
Yeah, they're big and blotchy, some of them.
That's what bothers me about this picture. You have these things which I call the blotches.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Okay. And these big hunks here, they're caused by snowflakes which are falling right in front of the lens. So they're big and they're much more prominent as they're coming right in front of the lens. And that can be an issue. Here's an example of the same sort of thing, taking a picture of the Stone Arch Bridge in Keene. And you can see all these blotches of snowflakes. Hard to know how to deal with this. If you have a very long exposure, you might turn all these blotches into streaks that may not be quite as obvious, but it's hard to deal with. The way I typically deal with this, again, sadly involves software. I take multiple images of the same place, usually at least two, but sometimes three. And then I put them all together in software. And to think of it, they're all sort of in layers together, one on top of the other. And the only one you see is the one that's on top. All the other layers are below. And all the layers have blotches, but they don't have the blotches in the same area. So once you get them all together, you can take a blotch like this and just erase it from the top layer so that the next layer down shows through, and that layer is likely to be clear. So when you have a situation like this, you put them all together, you can erase these. Again, the technicalities about how it's done, but you can quickly erase these things and have the lower layers shine through so you don't see the blotches. And you can get a picture like this. Again, it involves a little software. It's not that complicated. It just shows you why you probably want to learn how to do Lightroom and Photoshop. This is not something you can do in Lightroom, by the way. You need to be in Photoshop to do this. Here's another solution to the blotches. I took this picture to show the difference of even small differences in exposure on how the snow looks. Here at a 20th of a second, you look here in the barn and the tractor, you can see streaks. If you just go to a 60th of a second, they look more like little pieces of snowflakes. So you can see the difference in the appearance with just this small change. But the other thing I noted in this image was I wasn't seeing any blotches. And the reason I wasn't seeing any blotches was because I shot this from a porch. and there was enough of an overhang of the porch, so I wasn't getting snowflakes that were close to the lens. They were blocked off. And so another thing you can do is to put yourself in this sort of situation. I often suggest if you have an umbrella, you can have somebody hold the umbrella up above the lens, out of the frame, obviously. So it's blocking the snowflakes coming in right close to the lens, and you can get rid of the blotches. Kind of a technical thing, but thing that always bothers me, and I've always had to try to find ways to get around it. If you're taking pictures of snow while the snow is still coming down. Now, after the snow flies, you have a time when the storm moves away. And here's where we talk about taking pictures at the edges of storms. There's no snow falling. The storm has just moved out. You can see the trailing edge of the clouds here. This is early in the morning. This at Stonewall Farm. This was taken some years ago. You can tell because the houses that are on the hill here now were just had some dirt piled up where they were digging foundations. But this was a nice early morning picture with fog right at the surface, snow on the trees, a dramatic picture. And one thing to point out here about snow photography is that you want to try to catch pictures of the snow photography while the snow is still on the trees. Oftentimes in these situations, snow will be on the trees, the sun will come out, it'll melt and it'll all fall off. You'll still have pretty snow on the ground, but you won't have that frosting of the trees and other things. We refer to this as the winter wonderland picture. So you want to try to catch the winter wonderland time before you lose all the stuff on the foliage. And you get that right at the edge of the storm. Here's another example of edge of the storm kind of pictures. I was in my office finishing up and the thunderstorm came through and was heading east. So I ran out, went up Chapman Road in Keene, looking on towards Mount Monadnock. And Shelley, I'm sorry, we keep on talking about Mount Monadnock. It's our mountain, and it's the only one we have. So we went.
Yeah.
But looking at Mount Monadnock, I knew the storm was heading that way, so I rushed up to see if I could catch it. And I caught the thunderhead over Mount Monadnock at a time when there was already light coming through from behind the storm. Pictures of the surf around a storm on the coast often shows the biggest waves after the storm has passed, as they've had a chance to fetch up on shore. In this example, the storm was just passing. There was still a little mist in the air, but you had the nice surf. Now, one of the most magical times that you can look at the edge of a storm is when you see a rainbow. And people often think of seeing a rainbow as just sort of a lucky break. This one was. We were with friends having dinner in a cottage on Rye Beach, and someone came running in saying, "Did you see the rainbow?" A storm had just passed through and was on its way towards the Isle of Shoals. And looking into the storm with the sun breaking behind us, we saw this beautiful double rainbow. You will notice, by the way, with double rainbows, in the second rainbow, the colors are reversed. I don't know if you knew that. This one you see ends in red, and that red picks up on this one. So the actual order of the colors in the rainbow reverse as you get to a second rainbow. So this is a kind of fortuitous thing that I caught, but there are ways to understand how rainbows form. It would allow you to predict when they form and also get an idea about where you ought to go to see them. So it doesn't just have to be a happy accident when you see a rainbow. This rainbow, I was at home in my office. I looked out, the storm had just passed. I looked out and there was this nice rainbow. The first thing I think about when I see a rainbow is what can I put in front of it to make it interesting? Broken record about context, but that's the thing I think about, is finding something interesting to put in the image. And with a rainbow, they tend to fade fairly quickly, so you need to have something nearby. And I always have some things in mind that I've sort of collected in my own mind about places I could go quickly so that I could catch the rainbow with some interesting context. In this case, I ran up to the Chesterfield Town Hall and was able to catch the rainbow still there. It was gone in about 30 seconds after I got there, but I was able to catch the picture. So how do rainbows form? It's really all a matter of physics. The light comes into a raindrop. It is bent and refracted so that you get a separation of the colors of the white light. It bounces on the back of the droplet, comes down and comes out where it is refracted again so that you get the distribution of colors. This occurs, millions of times in a storm cloud so that you get the appearance of the rainbow. There are some basic things about the formation of the rainbow. Typically around here, it occurs in the first light after an evening storm. More often in the summer where we have thunderstorms coming through, they most often come from west to east. And they come in the evening, they'll come through, and then the sun will be behind you coming out and shining into the cloud. Like you see here, the sun was off to the right, shining into this cloud. It was still close enough so you could see the effect of the raindrops. When that happens, you get a rainbow, the first light after an evening storm. The sun must be down at least 42 degrees. It can't be higher or the spectrum of light will get shown right into the ground and you won't see it. So it has to be later in the evening. Around this time of year, it may be 5:30 or so, maybe earlier, when you can have a storm pass and have the sun low enough so that you can see the rainbow. The colors do become more intense as the sun goes down until it's lost in the horizon. And the way you see it is you stand with your back to the sun. You have to have the sun come out bright after the storm passes. Stand with your back to the sun, looking at the cloud as it recedes, and you should almost routinely see a rainbow in that situation. So when you know a storm is coming through, you kind of get yourself in a position where you know it's going to pass and the sun's going to come out, and then you can catch the rainbow. Okay? And again, you want to find something in the foreground of interest when you're going to see the colors in the sky. And it doesn't help to be lucky. You have to get in the right spot at the right time, but this can really help you position it. Now, this business of foreground of interest is important. I mean, oftentimes you'll see on Facebook pictures like this. People will say, look, I saw a beautiful rainbow. And people come on Facebook and say, oh, wonderful picture, beautiful rainbow. It's fantastic. Ooh. And it's really trash. Now, you got the rainbow, but you got all this crap around it. Nothing really of much interest. You want to get something better than that. Get out to a point that's of interest. Just to give you an example of this, I was, again, sitting at my desk and a storm had come through. My wife has heard me talk about rainbows enough, so she knows the conditions that might often cause the rainbow. And she suggested that I look for a rainbow because a nice thunderhead had just passed and there was sun coming out. I looked outside and I didn't see a rainbow, but I knew the storm was moving away towards the east and the sun was out behind it. So I got in the car and I chased the back edge of the storm as it receded. I went down, I finally saw the rainbow when I got down in Keene. The first time I saw it was down as you first get down into Keene on Production Ave, where the Subaru dealership is and so forth. And I was able to get it with something of sort of interest in the foreground, not gorgeous, but interesting. But this was the first time I saw the rainbow as I was chasing it, because I knew it had to be there. And I kept chasing it. It was heading generally more southeast. So I went down Route 12 and was able to see it again as I went along the road. Again, not a very interesting foreground, but I thought I'd catch it. You can see the hint of a second rainbow here. I started thinking about where I might go to catch it, where there was something interesting. And I hope I could get down towards Troy, where I could get a view of Mount Monadnock. And I was hoping the rainbow would be there. When I wanted to go where I knew there was a good view of the mountain, which is in the cemetery, which is just north of the village. When I got there, I caught the rainbow again. Unfortunately, the mountain was all in cloud, but this time at least I had something a little more interesting to put in front of the rainbow, like this little gazebo. And just as the sun was going down before the rainbow faded, I got this nice, really nice semicircular rainbow looking out over the cemetery with the last light. So it's an example of how, if you know what you're looking for and where you need to be oriented in relationship to a passing storm, you can know that you're going to see the rainbow. so you can get out there and find those. Now, most often see rainbows in the evening because we get the storms that come through. It doesn't have to be evening. You could have a rainbow from in the early morning with the sunrise if you have the right conditions. This was a sunrise rainbow. This was in Doolin, Ireland, year before last. And the sun was coming up, and I was taking pictures of the cows, and then I went back into our hotel and looked out, and I said, oh my God, the rainbow had formed. And in this case, it really wasn't a passing storm. I think what was forming it was the mist coming off the North Atlantic, because we were right on the edge here. And the sun in this case was rising behind us in the east, and we were looking towards the west here. So you don't have to be in the evening, but generally in New England, that's when you're going to see it. So wanted to talk about nighttime photography, and two things. I've already talked somewhat about getting pictures of the moon, and I also want to talk about getting pictures of the stars. Going to the moon photography, one question I didn't talk about is how do I know where to be in order to get a picture of the moon rising where I want to see it? Because you want to see something interesting again that the moon can rise behind. In our area, that's typically you want to get it to rise somewhere in relationship to Mount Monadnock. So how do you get these kind of pictures? Again, you're looking for a full moon, and there's a program called the Photographer's Ephemeris, which is a fantastic program. It's free. You can just get it online. And it does a number of things. First of all, it shows you the times of moonrise and moonset and so forth. Here you can see that the moonrise was at 4:18. And notice that the sunset was almost the same time. And again, with a full moon, the sunset is pretty much always at around the same time as the moonrise. So that shows that. The other thing the program does is it shows you a Google map picture, and you can put a little pin anywhere on this map and you'll get these lines. And these lines show you for this day, and this was in November 13th, 2016, it shows you where the sun will rise and where it will set in direction, where the moon will rise and where the moon will set. So this is Mount Monadnock, and if you want to get a picture of the moon rising over Mount Monadnock, all you have to do is find a place where you can put the pin where the line will go right there where you want it. I didn't want to put it right on top of the mountain because this is right when the moon rises at the horizon, and that means it won't be up over Monadnock for some time because it's higher. So I put it somewhere off to the side. And then I had this line, and I could just look along the line and try to figure out where was a good place to put myself to take a picture of the moonrise. So I know the direction. The other thing that I want to do when you do take this picture is to get far away from your subject. And I put myself 15 miles away from Mount Monadnock. And the reason is that you want to use your maximum telephoto lens so that the moon will be big. But when you do that, you want to be able to see the stuff in your foreground. And if you get too close, then you can't have a long lens because then you're just going to see the moon. Here's an example of that. This is the Church of Our Lady before Tyne in the old city square in Prague, and the moon is up here. I couldn't have a 400 millimeter lens to take this picture and see the church and the moon. And so the moon was really quite small. However, getting this far away, I could use my 400 millimeter lens and still have the mountain in the frame, just looking nice and big. So doing this, I found a spot and I found a road. And the day before I rode up it to try to see if there was a break in the hills that would show Mount Monadnock. And I found one little col that opened up on the mountain. And I knew that from the angle that I was sitting to the mountain, that would be the spot that would be able to show me the moon as it rose. So I went the next night and set up and was able to get this picture. Looking through the col with the telephoto lens, the moon was nice and big up against the mountain. And again, I caught it at moonrise so that there was still the blue hour so you could see the mountains in front.
Just one sec, Jeffrey, over there on your Canon camera, did you put it on B mode? B?
Bulb?
You know, the dial over there, B
Yeah.
for Bravo.
Now, B stands for bulb, and it basically is a setting where if you hit the shutter will stay open as long as you press the shutter.
Okay,
My Canon camera can be set to take an exposure as long as 30 seconds, and that's as far as you can go.
and you require a high ISO for this, would you?
No, it wasn't that dark.
Okay.
This was during the blue hour. The moon is really quite bright in the sky.
Yeah, okay,
So you really don't have to have a long exposure. This is not as if we were taking a picture of stars, which we'll talk
all
about.
right.
But you can use that program. You ought to find it because once you know that there's going to be a moonrise, or you want to catch the sunrise in a particular location, you can put these things right where you want them and know where to stand to see it. And it's remarkable how this program works. It told me exactly where the moon was going to be. Always amazes me every time, but it works every time. You can pick it right where you want it. And this was in a little small col between two hills where I could see Mount Monadnock through it. And again, you want to have a long lens to make the moon look large. Therefore, you need to get far away so that the thing you're going to capture in the foreground can be seen.
And did you have a 400 mm lens for this?
I shot this with a 400 millimeter lens.
All right.
Okay. Let's finish up talking about stars. One of the advantages with digital camera is you can get some great images of the night sky, most notably and most popularly the Milky Way, seeing our galaxy on edge. The center of the galaxy is about here, and the galaxy shows up most prominently when you see it in the south. The galaxy comes right across the top and goes down to the north, but the most prominent areas are in the southern districts. You need to try to find a spot to shoot that's dark, and it's hard to find those around here. I often will go up to Walpole because I can get away from major cities. That's the main thing you want to do. And even with that, you see the light here, and you may think that this is sunrise, but this is just the light coming from Brattleboro, looking from Walpole. This is in Allison's Orchard. This was an old maple tree that was sitting at the top of the ridge for years, a classic, and then it got hit a couple times by lightning, and they had to cut it all down, and now it's just a stump. But I caught it as something nice to put in the foreground as I was taking these pictures. There are a number of things you need to do to try to accomplish this kind of picture, because if you look at the Milky Way, it's really quite dim. Even on a very dark night, you can see kind of get a sense of a cloudiness, but it doesn't look anything like this. Here you see it quite well defined. The dark areas in here are actually the effects of dust cutting down the lights as it comes through. But to get a picture like this, you need a number of things. First of all, you need high ISO, so you can get this well exposed. I usually shoot at an ISO of 1600 to 3200. You do get noise, and you have to deal with that. You want to have a wide aperture. You want to get as much light in as you can. I use my 16 to 35 millimeter wide angle lens, and I have it open as far as it'll go, which is 2.8. And you need a long exposure. You want to get as much light in. But the problem with long exposures is that the stars are always moving in the sky. If you take a really long exposure, they'll look like this. You'll get these rings. But even with much less exposure, these dots of light can begin to look like little blurs. So you have to know how long you can expose before the stars will look blurry. And that has to do with the focal length of the lens. The wider angle the lens, the longer you can expose and take light in. If you think of it, you're getting a bigger area, so the movement of an individual star becomes less in the field of view of a wide angle lens. So I always use my widest angle lens, which goes to 16 millimeters, and that's always the way I shoot. The way you can figure out how long you can shoot before you get the blurring effect is to use something called a rule of 500. Actually, most people talk of a rule of 600, but I like to use the rule of 500. And what that says is that your exposure should be no longer than 500 divided by the focal length. So with my 16 mm lens, that means I can shoot for about 30 seconds, which is about the limit of the regular setting of my camera. So that's often what I'll shoot. I'll shoot somewhere between 20 and 30 seconds. You want to have the longest you can without getting blurring, but still getting as much light as you can get in. If you don't have a wide angle lens, it can be more of an issue. If you shoot with a 50 mm lens, that means you can only shoot for 10 seconds. So you get a third of the amount of light that you would get in with a wider angle. And it won't look as prominent as you see here. So you want to try to set up to shoot towards the south. You want to find a place that has as little extraneous light as possible and shoot high ISO, wide as aperture as you can, as long exposure as you can, using the rule of 50 based on whatever wide angle lens you have. And obviously you have to have this on a stable tripod. And you need to focus at infinity, which can be difficult at dark. What you can do is you can find a bright star and then look at the live view and zoom in on it, and then adjust your focus and then hold it there. I will typically have my focus set for infinity, and then I'll put a piece of electrical tape over the lens so that the focus ring can't move as I'm moving it around. Now, there is a galaxy, a Milky Way that goes off from the south all the way around to the north. And one of the first times I really noticed the stars in an image that I was shooting was one time when I was shooting Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone. I was set up at night. The geyser was lit by lights coming from the lodge, which was right over here to the left, and I would have long exposures. When I came out, I found that I had all these beautiful stars in the skies, and I could see here the northern edge, the northern limb, if you will, of the Milky Way. Nowhere near as prominent as the south, but still there and interesting. The interesting thing about the northern limb of the Milky Way is this thing right here in the image. And I saw this little smudge, and I looked closely at it, and I thought I knew what it was. And in fact, as you get closer, it is actually the Andromeda Galaxy, our closest major galaxy. And that shows up if you look at the edge of the northern rim of the Milky Way. This is 2.5 million light years away, and it's heading toward us. It'll collide with our galaxy in 4.5 billion years. It should be a great show. I can't wait. It'll be great. Now, there are other things in the night sky that you can see. Another interesting thing is comets. Sometimes these can be hard to see. The typical rule is that people will tell you there's going to be a great comet and it's going to be light up the sky, and then you go out and you can't even find the thing. That was largely true of the Pan-STAR comet back in 2013. The only way I really found it was to know where it was supposed to be in the sky. I took pictures, and then I actually looked in the back of my screen and zoomed in until I could actually see it. Then I knew where to aim, and I took a longer exposure. This last summer, we had the Neowise comet, which was someone you could actually see faintly in the sky. Did everyone see this? It was in July. And it was fairly faint, but you take a long exposure and you can get a decent shot. This was probably around 30 seconds. You can notice, by the way, how the stars have a little bit of a smudge on them because I've really pushed it as far as I can go. But you can see the comets. So there's a number of things you can see in the night sky that can be very interesting. So let's finish up. I think the important thing here is that you want to embrace what nature provides you. There's all sorts of interesting things to see around here and different kinds of light, whether it's golden light or harsh, bright midday sun, overcast or fog, or even night light. They all have their own individual attractions, opportunities, and challenges. It's just a matter of doing what you need to do to get what you can from the light that's provided. So in New England, it's never a bad time to go out shooting as long as you accept the challenge of embracing what nature provides you. You can't always get the picture you want in the particular light you're given. You have to take the light you're given and get the most out of it. And with that, we are done. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now get out and go shooting.
Yeah.
Are there?
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank
Now,
you.
as you go along, if you have questions, you can certainly email me or call me. You know, this whenever it comes up.
All right.
Hopefully you have a head start here. Now you just need to get out and shoot a lot and make a
Yep.
lot of mistakes. And then because you're shooting digital, you'll be able to figure out why you made the mistake and you can go from there.
Yeah.
Very good.
All
Great.
right.
All right. Hope to see you around.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shelley should come and visit the Monadnock region.
Yeah, I have to. My word, it's beautiful.
Sure you said something interesting, but I can't understand.
Our internet is spotty.
Okay.
Well,
Well,
yeah,
bye, everybody. Okay.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.